Chapter 1 Borley Rectory. Borley is quiet in a way that feels intentional. The village sits low in the Essex countryside, surrounded by fields that flatten sound and stretch distance. Even today, visitors remark on how still it feels, not peaceful, but expectant. In the late 19th century, that quiet was broken by the construction of a large Victorian rectory, built in 1862 to house the local Anglican clergy. It was an ordinary building in purpose, but never in behavior. Long before the house gained a reputation, there were already local accounts of something being wrong with the land. Stories of a nun seen walking the grounds, of figures crossing the fields at dusk, of footsteps where no one stood. These stories existed before newspapers, before investigators, before anyone had anything to gain by telling them. When the Bull family moved in, the reports became written rather than spoken. Reverend Henry Bull and his wife recorded unexplained sounds almost immediately. Footsteps in corridors at night, doors opening and closing, bells ringing without cords attached. These were not isolated moments. They were repetitive, patterned, and persistent. Guests heard them too. Servants mentioned them quietly. No one could ever show a cause. What unsettled people most was not the noise, but the timing. The phenomena did not happen randomly. They occurred when the house was calm, when rooms were empty, when no emotional stress or excitement could explain them away. Years later, after the Bulls had gone, the Smith family arrived. By then, Borley had gained a reputation, but the Smiths did not arrive seeking attention. In fact, they avoided it. Yet it was during their tenancy that the most disturbing events were recorded. Objects were thrown violently across rooms. Stones appeared indoors with no entry point. Writing began appearing on walls. Messages scratched or chalked in plain view where moments earlier there had been nothing. The most famous phrase, "Get light, mass, pray," appeared suddenly during a séance, but other writings appeared without séances, without darkness, without suggestion. Witnesses watched walls closely. The messages still appeared. These were not single witness claims. On multiple occasions, independent observers were present: neighbors, visitors, journalists, clergy. People with no connection to one another and no shared expectations. Eventually, researcher Harry Price became involved. His later reputation would be contested, but this matters less than one uncomfortable fact. Even his harshest critics admitted Borley could not be fully explained. Price imposed controls. He sealed rooms. He logged dates and times. He required signed statements. Phenomena still occurred. Some events were later exposed as exaggerated. A few were likely hoaxes. But when the exaggerations are stripped away, something remains. Incidents witnessed by multiple adults. Sometimes when the house was empty. Sometimes when no one had access. In 1939, Borley Rectory burned down. During the fire, observers claimed to see a figure in the ruins. Later, a human skeleton was discovered in the rubble. Speculation exploded, but forensic examination suggested the remains predated the house itself. The rectory was never rebuilt. What followed should have ended the story. It didn't. Reports continued after the fire. Lights seen where walls no longer stood. Footsteps across foundations. The same sense that the place had not finished with the people who came to look at it. Borley's power lies not in what it proves, but in what it resists. Skeptics cannot dismiss it cleanly. Believers cannot explain it fully. The documentation is too extensive to ignore, and too inconsistent to accept blindly. Borley does not shout. It persists. And that persistence across families, decades, investigators, and even the absence of a building is why Borley Rectory remains Britain's most unsettling location. Not because it was haunted, but because it never agreed to be silent. Shadows of Britain. Chapter 2. Saddleworth Moor. Saddleworth Moor does not welcome people. The land rises quietly from the edge of Greater Manchester into open, exposed high ground, where weather arrives without warning and leaves without apology. On clear days, the moor looks endless and empty. On bad days, it closes in, flattening sound and distance until direction loses meaning. Paths disappear, landmarks blur. Even experienced walkers say the same thing. It is easy to become disoriented here. That is why the moor was chosen. In the early 1960s, it became the burial ground for crimes that Britain would never forget. The murders committed by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley ended lives, but the moor became the second victim. a place permanently altered by what it concealed. What many people misunderstand is that Saddleworth's unease does not come from stories of ghosts. It comes from absence. Families waited years, sometimes decades, not knowing where their children lay. Searches were conducted again and again. Helicopters scanned. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across the peat. Every time the wind changed, the land seemed to shift, erasing yesterday's certainty. Brady understood the moor. He knew how quickly it could hide what it was given. He knew that waterlogged peat preserves and destroys at the same time. He used the landscape deliberately, confident that even if he were caught, the land would continue his work. And it did. Some remains were found, others were not. For the families, the moor became a place they were drawn back to against their will. Not out of belief in hauntings, but out of unfinished grief. The absence of a grave creates a specific kind of pain, one that does not resolve with time. It lingers, like the fog that settles without warning across the high ground. After Brady and Hindley were imprisoned, something unexpected happened. The moor did not return to being just a moor. Walkers began reporting an overwhelming sense of unease unrelated to the weather. Not fear exactly, something quieter. A pressure, a heaviness. People described the same reaction in different words. A sudden urge to leave, a feeling of being watched without any clear direction, a sense that they were intruding somewhere they should not remain. There were no apparitions, no footsteps behind them, no dramatic events, just the feeling. Mountain rescue teams, who know the land better than anyone, noted how often lost walkers became confused in the same areas, even with maps and GPS. Holland Brown Knoll, in particular, became known as a place where orientation failed more frequently than expected. Compasses worked, technology worked. And still, people misjudged distance, time, and direction. Psychologists would later argue that knowledge of the crimes primed visitors to feel fear, but that explanation only works for those who knew. Some of the reports came from people unaware of the history, tourists, hikers, visitors passing through. The reactions were often identical. There is another layer that rarely gets discussed. Peat moorland absorbs sound. Wind moves differently across it. Fog reduces depth perception so dramatically that objects appear closer or further away than they are. The land itself interferes with the senses. Over time, researchers studying environmental psychology noted that prolonged exposure to such landscapes can cause mild dissociation, a sense of detachment, unease, or altered awareness. Saddleworth does this naturally. Layer that with trauma, decades of searches, grief, withheld truth, and the result is not a haunting in the traditional sense. It is a place saturated with memory. Even after Brady's death in 2017, the moor did not give up everything it held. Some families still have no remains to bury. Some answers never arrived. When a place becomes the final witness to that kind of silence, it changes how people experience it. Visitors still report moments where sound drops away suddenly, where the wind stops without reason, where the fog seems to arrive too fast, too thick, too precisely. These are not paranormal events, they are environmental ones, but the human mind does not separate environment from meaning. We respond to places as much as to stories, and on Saddleworth Moor, the story is written into the ground. There are no ghosts walking the paths. There doesn't need to be. The unease comes from knowing that the land once hid terrible truths, and that some of those truths were never fully recovered. The moor does not accuse, it does not explain. It simply remains open, quiet, and unresolved. Saddleworth Moor is not haunted by spirits. It is haunted by what was never returned.